Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of this week. And I've realized I've got 9 coming your way next week. Crazy. No rest for the wicked. Anyway, the 32nd Infantry Division fought from Buna to Luzon, a total of 654 days of combat, more than any other U.S. Army division. Mark Van Ells is the author of Red Arrow Across the Pacific and joins us to tell their story. The links to purchasing his book are, of course, in the description below, or you can get it wherever you get your books. And I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
I'm not too bad. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I think we were just talking about this, the dark days of the 1950s and 60s with all the movies coming about the Marine Corps, Battle Cry and Halls of Montezuma, all those things there, is that people didn't seem to understand that the Army, the US Army were incredibly active, arguably way more so than the Marines in the Pacific. But do you think in recent years people have understood that it isn't just the Marines in the Pacific?
I think so. I mean, for those here in the United States anyway, who follow World War II, it does sit still, from what I can tell, to be more Eurocentric. But yes, there's interest in the Pacific, especially given the importance of East Asia and the Pacific in today's world. Perhaps that increases some attention. And there was always that version of the Pacific War where the Marines did it all, right? I suppose the shadow of John Wayne continued for a long, long time. And it's oftentimes said that the Marine Corps is much better at publicity than
they were pretty good at it.
The Army was. But yeah, there have been works in more recent years about the role of the Army, the Southwest Pacific. The Marines weren't there very much. The U.S. Army participated a lot in the Central Pacific. I think the Philippine campaign in particular is underappreciated.
Definitely.
And I think that I'm not sure if it's starting to turn. I think there's more information and knowledge about the U.S. Army's role in the Pacific.
I mean, I think it's a rabbit hole to go down. But I think when the Philippines is talked about, it's often talked about in sort of policy terms of MacArthur and which ways should they be going towards Japan, as opposed to actually the units that are there doing the fighting. It's looked at from a too higher point of view in some ways. But anyway, we're going to go down
or the fall of the Philippines, Bataan, that sort of thing is focused.
The early part, but not the later part. But anyway, folks, I'm bringing up Mark's slides and screen. So, if you have questions, sort of specifically about the details that's on one of the slides, kind of fire away with those as we're going along. But if you have broader questions about perhaps Mark's ongoing research or the legacy of his project, feel free to ask them, and we'll ask them at the end of the show. But I'm going to hand over to Mark to take us through this story now, and give a bit of love for the Army. So over to you.
Sure. Well, first, I'll talk about my interest in the 32nd Division. I suppose one of the questions is why this division? I'm originally from Wisconsin, and the 32nd Division was the National Guard division from Wisconsin and Michigan. So this is an organization that's been part of my upbringing when I was a child. I saw that red arrow in the community, in the park, in monuments. I had relatives who served in the division. So in my upbringing, it was always kind of there in the background. When I was younger, I didn't really care much about military affairs, but it was always sort of there. And when I started to study history professionally and then started to gravitate towards military history and the social history of the GI in particular, as I looked at the body of work on the Second World War, I noticed there had not been very much written about the 32nd Division, even though, as you noted, it had a very long history, more time in combat than any other U.S. Army division during the Second World War. It didn't participate in any of the signature or famous battles of the Pacific like Guadalcanal or Okinawa, but it was fighting at that same time, oftentimes overshadowed by these more famous battles where the Marines were, by the way. And so it seemed to have been left out of the narrative of the Pacific War. And so I decided to write this book to put the 32nd Division back into the conversation, basically.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so I'll start by talking about the background to the 32nd Division. And it was founded in the First World War when the United States entered that conflict in 1917. As I noted before, it was made up of National Guard divisions from Wisconsin and Michigan. It was shipped over to France, and it had a rather impressive record in France during the Second World War, the Meuse-Argonne affair, Meuse-Argonne offensive, other battles in which it had participated. The 32nd Division always managed to pierce German lines. And so towards the end of the war, when the division was developing an emblem, divisions were, permanent divisions were a new thing in the American military. They're looking for an emblem, and they came up with this idea of the red arrow. So you see the red arrow pointing upward. You see the horizontal bar across the shaft. That horizontal bar, of course, represents the German lines, and the arrow represents piercing those German lines. And from that point on, the division would be known as the Red Arrow Division. So that's where the name comes from. Between the wars, the National Guard in the United States was not terribly well trained. There wasn't a lot of monetary support for the military. The United States had a largely isolationist foreign policy. A lot of people believed that the oceans protected America from the world's problems. So these soldiers oftentimes weren't trained very well. They had weekly drills, 2 weeks of summer camp, no real basic training or anything like that. And so their training had fallen into disrepair, I guess you might say. Now, if we fast forward to 1940, this is when the United States begins its mobilization for World War II. It had already broken out in Europe and Asia, and there was increasing concern in the United States. So that's when the draft begins in 1940. And that's also when the National Guard was mobilized to get the National Guard, all of the Army, really. But here in this specific case, the National Guard up to speed. So the 32nd Division was called up in October of 1940. It was sent to Louisiana, first at a place called Camp Beauregard, later at a new improved camp called Camp Livingston. Both were located near the city of Alexandria, Louisiana, in the central part of the state. The U.S. Army had basically transformed central Louisiana into a major training and maneuver ground. There was Camp Livingston, Camp Claiborne, where the 82nd Airborne Division had trained, Fort Polk. So there were many camps in the area. The Red Arrow Division was sent there to basically learn the real trade of being a soldier. Again, their training between the wars was inadequate. And many Red Arrow soldiers, they commented, I thought I knew what I was doing. And when I got to the training camp, I found out I really didn't know what I was doing. And so there were all the usual things you find in a training camp, the fatigue duties. Here you see the soldiers peeling potatoes, for example, but also learning how to use their weapons, maneuver, those kinds of things. One of the things that really strikes me on these photographs is just how young and innocent many of these young men look. And I'll go back to this one here too. They look so fresh-faced. Yep. They look so optimistic. And if you compared these pictures to what combat soldiers looked like when they came off the line, you can see that they're in for something that they really don't understand yet. And to a certain degree, no level of training is going to prepare them for that. But they're starting to learn the real trade of being a soldier. So the Red Arrow Division participated in maneuvers. There were the famous Louisiana maneuvers of September 1941, the single largest field maneuvers to this day ever conducted by the U.S. Army. Something like 400,000 American soldiers participated in these war games. But they are just war games. And they're mostly trained because the expectation was that they would be going to Europe. Central Louisiana, it had a landscape that was roughly equivalent to what you might find in France or Germany, warm enough, of course, for year-round training. So this is not jungle warfare that they're being trained for. The expectation was that they would be going to Europe. And it was while they were in Louisiana that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States did officially enter the Second World War. And the 32nd Division was on the move pretty quickly. Within 2 months, the 32nd Division was gone from Louisiana. It packed up and it moved to Fort Devens, Massachusetts on the East Coast. It was destined to go to Great Britain. It was supposed to be one of the first American divisions to head to Britain. And in fact, its engineering unit had already shipped off to Northern Ireland. But then officials in Washington changed the direction of the division. Things in the Pacific were getting very desperate as well. And I'm sure everyone knows, of course, in the Allied strategy, Europe was the primary theater, Germany first, but the Pacific most certainly couldn't be ignored as well. And the Japanese had a tremendous amount of success, as I think everyone knows, in 1941 and 1942. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor, of course. The Japanese attacked all across the Pacific, Southeast Asia, Singapore had fallen. General MacArthur is hanging on barely in the Philippines and is about to be ejected from there. The Japanese moved into New Guinea at Rabaul, the big base at Rabaul, and Australia was threatened. And Australia was remarkably vulnerable in 1942. It was part of the British Empire. Its combat units were all in the Mediterranean. Well, nearly all were in the Mediterranean. And so Australia was largely defenseless, I guess you might say. They had their own militia with the usual problems you have with part-time soldiers. And there was concern that the Japanese might invade Australia. Certainly, the coasts of Australia were being attacked and things were looking pretty desperate. And so the United States sent 2 infantry divisions to Australia. The 41st Division went, and the 32nd Division went. So what that meant was that the Red Arrow had, in Massachusetts, mind you, on the East Coast, had to pack up again, take a cross-country rail trip to San Francisco, then get on ships and go all the way across the Pacific, basically halfway around the world, to get to Australia. It landed there in May of 1942. They first landed in Adelaide. They stayed in South Australia for a couple of months and then moved northward to a place called Camp Cable, which the Red Arrow Division built. In fact, that was near Brisbane. So in the span of 6 months, the division had literally gone halfway around the world, from the American South to the East Coast to the West Coast, and then down under. So, yeah, as I think I say in the book, that's more than most people would ever travel in their lifetimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick question for you. I mean, we've talked about this on the channel before. I feel that there's been a generation of some early historians and readers of history who use the words National Guard as almost an insult. And there's even a suggestion, even later in the war, that they're only a National Guard division. It occurs with the British as well, with the territorial battalions or territorial units. Yeah. But you've made it clear that the 32nd have been through pretty much the same process from 1940 to this period as the regular army divisions have done. The regular army divisions were not getting the up-to-date training. You know, the American Army famously had, what was it, 130 tanks in 1940 or something like that. Yeah. So I feel that people hear regular army division, they think, oh, well, these guys are professionals, they know what they're doing. National Guard, oh, they're the part-time ones, they don't know what they're doing. Does that annoy you as much as it annoys me?
Well, I wasn't in the Army. I was in the military, but not in the Army. I was active duty. I was not in the National Guard. I don't have any personal say in it, um, or any personal stake in it, really.
Mm.
What I will say is that, yes, at this time, most certainly, there was a deep suspicion of
Yeah.
the National Guard among the regulars. This idea that they weren't very well trained. And before Louisiana, there's no doubt about that. I think it's really hard to make the case that the National Guard was up to date before they went to
Yeah,
Louisiana.
they're never ready out of the box, so to speak. But then no units are going into combat straight out of the box. They're all going through training and weapons, appreciation, all that, etc., etc. So I just, I think there's this perception that these are literally people sometimes. Even it happens in Normandy with the 29th Division, the National Guard Division. Well, by 1944, they've been doing it for years. I mean, it's very annoying. But it's interesting to have your thoughts. But back to you.
Sure. Yeah, those ideas still persisted, and even after all the training. And one of the concerns a lot of regular Army officers had about the 32nd Division was, in particular, that many of the officers were still in place, and the prejudice, the attitude of many regular Army soldiers was that these National Guard officers were not up to snuff. Individual results vary, of course. And if you look at the book, there were some National Guard officers who were not very good and some who became very, very competent combat commanders. So individual situations vary, of course. But that was the prejudice and that was the attitude. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of people were very suspicious of the 32nd Division, that many of these officers were not really very well trained. They were politicians from small towns across the Midwest who got their positions because they were wealthy or well connected, and that they weren't very good. So throughout, especially the early half of the war, as we'll see here in a minute, by 1944, a lot of these National Guard officers either have risen to top positions or have been kicked out or were killed or wounded and are no longer there. So by 1944, the division was effectively nationalized already, but especially early in the period here, that idea persisted that the division's officers in particular weren't very good, including right at MacArthur's headquarters. And they sometimes singled out individual officers whom they saw as being problematic. So that you're right, that these National Guard soldiers got the same training that regular Army soldiers did. The real tension was in the officer corps, and they're, again, individuals are individuals. I guess is how I'd respond to that.
Brilliant, thank you. Back to you.
Okay, so they end up in Australia here again. 6 months, they had gone basically halfway around the world. And so they begin training in Australia. But their training in Australia was pretty much the same sort of thing that they got in Louisiana, even though it was pretty clear now. Here we're talking mid-1942. They're in Australia. They're obviously, again, there was no realistic fear, no realistic scenario in which the Japanese were going to invade Australia. It was pretty clear that they were going to the jungles of New Guinea, but that's still not what they were really trained to do. So as Eichelberger himself said, it was just more of the same training, and they were not being prepared for what was pretty clearly lying ahead for them. So this slide here, I've got some bullet points here about what the division was like on the eve of battle, what its issues and problems were, and there were many. As we'll see here, it was really not prepared to take on the Japanese as equals in 1942. One thing is very clear is that the division was confident. There was a great esprit de corps. They were filled with stories of the Red Arrow Division during the First World War and its record in that conflict. There was a lot of confidence that Americans could pretty much do anything, that the Japanese can't defeat us. So there's a lot of confidence. And after Louisiana, of course, they felt well-trained. So there was a lot of confidence, but no experience whatsoever. You had only a very small handful of officers in the division who had been in the First World War. Many of them had already been purged as being too old, right? So the confidence, but no real experience. As I noted before, their training was inadequate. They didn't have anything like jungle boots, for example, right? They were told to make sure your shoes are well oiled because you're going to be in the jungle. Well, that's not really going to be adequate in a jungle situation. Even their fatigues, they didn't have real combat fatigues. They famously, they took their regular denim uniforms, work uniforms, and dyed them green before they shipped them off. And some of the stories the soldiers tell is that they were still wet and dripping as they put them on to head to New Guinea.
Wow.
The uniforms weren't very breathable. You know, I mean, it was just, they were not prepared for this kind of thing. I should also note that being constantly on the move, you know, even had their training program been adequate, you know, for jungle warfare, concealment, and night operations, all these sorts of things, even if they had been doing that, because they're constantly on the move, that certainly diminished the training effectiveness. They were really not in any one place more than, you know, after Pearl Harbor, in no one place really for more than 2, maybe 3 months, let's say. And so that's certainly going to make the training less effective. We already covered this topic, but I put the bullet point here: the questionable leadership, the questions a lot of people had about the National Guard officers in particular. Many had been purged over time. I should say, just before they left Louisiana, there was a major purge. So many reservists had come in, but were these reservists any more up to the task than older weekend warriors, quote unquote? Where that's an open question as well. And we'll get to MacArthur here in a minute as well. I think there are questions at the top of the command structure as well. Poor intelligence. The Allies really had no idea what the Japanese were up to and how many Japanese were there. Really, they had almost no idea. It was Colonel, later General Willoughby, who was MacArthur's intelligence chief, who one historian called him perhaps the stupidest intelligence chief in all of World War II. It really seemed to be guesswork, really, and some of this poor intelligence would lead to a lot of casualties and misery and heartache for not just the Red Arrow Division, but across the Pacific during the Second World War. And I think something else that needs to be kept in mind here is the naval dimension to this. You know, the Pacific is big, lots of islands. These ground soldiers have to get to the islands somehow. But the Navy had its hands full with Guadalcanal, which is a battle that began in August of 1942. And there wasn't a lot of Army-Navy cooperation. First of all, the Navy did not want to give MacArthur very much in the way of naval support. Again, the Navy's got its hands full. So the battle at Buna, this is not going to be one of those beach landings that you see in the movies. The Americans and the Australians are going to have to come at Buna over land, and the environment of New Guinea, the jungle, the mountains, was absolutely unforgiving. So getting soldiers where they need to go, supplying those soldiers, how do you make sure they have enough ammunition, the right kind of weapons, food, medical supplies, all those sorts of things? It's going to be very difficult to logistically sustain this operation without a sea link and without naval support. So that's another factor in the Red Arrows fight at Buna in Papua New Guinea. So here's the Allied leadership team. Let's take a look at each of these people. Of course, I noted, and I'm sure everyone is familiar already with General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area. MacArthur, one of America's most famous generals already, even before the Second World War. It was MacArthur who was in charge of the defense of the Philippines in 1941 and 1942, and many of his decisions in actions were quite questionable in the Philippines, trying to defend the beaches versus retreating to the Bataan Peninsula as the plans originally were. I suppose it's open to question how successfully the Americans could have resisted the Japanese invasion in the first place, but there are lots of questions about the way MacArthur handled the battle, his troops, and Roosevelt evacuated him from the Philippines. Yep. And he didn't get to the front. I mean, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the nickname Dugout Doug, right? He didn't go to Bataan, and Roosevelt ordered him out, but he lost that battle, and he went to Australia to command the Southwest Pacific area. But there are questions about his skills on the battlefield by this point.
Well, we could fill an entire episode about that and still not get closer to answering that one. But let's just say he has his fans and he has his haters.
He has his detractors, and I have to say that he was not very popular with the 32nd Division for reasons that we will outline here today. And real quickly, I'll also note his vainglory. You know, he craved attention, craved headlines, didn't play well with the other children, you might say. So he was a very difficult person to work for as well. Now, he's in command of, he's in charge of a command that involves not just American troops, but Australian, even the Dutch from what's now Indonesia. And Washington urged him to have a multinational command, but almost all of the top positions went to Americans. And he pretty much sidelined the Australians and the Dutch. One of the exceptions to this, the next person over is Sir Thomas Blamey. He was an Australian general. He was in command of Allied land forces. And as I noted, the 32nd Division was one of 2 American divisions in Australia, and 2 divisions make up a corps. So it was General Robert Eichelberger, who was the commander of I Corps. And the commander of the 32nd Division was General Edwin Forrest Harding. Harding was a very likable person. Pretty much everyone Harding met, they liked him. He was an intellectual, not only a military intellectual, but he liked literature. He liked history. I like history too. He was a likable person then, and he's a likable person if you study him. But there were also those who questioned whether or not he was tough enough to really lead troops in combat. So there were questions about Harding and his battlefield leadership also. But this is sort of the command structure above the 32nd Division. Now the division, first elements of the division arrived in September of 1942. So it might be helpful, and if I'm repeating things that you think your audience already knows, please just let me know. But let's see what's going on here in Papua, because this, for Americans anyway, this is an overlooked part of the Second World War. So this is the far eastern end of New Guinea, the Papuan Peninsula. And in July of 1942, Japanese forces landed on the north shore of Papua at a place called Buna. And then they began to march inland through the jungles and over the mountains, heading towards a place called Port Moresby, which was really the only, even city might be too optimistic of a term, but it was the best harbor on the island. It had airfields surrounding it. It was the Australian administrative capital for what was essentially their colony here in New Guinea. And the Japanese were headed for Port Moresby. Now, the Australians only had a very small number of troops in Papua at the time. Some Australian troops are beginning to come back from the Mediterranean, the 7th Division in particular, which is thrown into New Guinea. They land at Port Moresby and they go into the mountains to meet the Japanese on the trail that was the scene of the battle called the Kokoda Track. And the Japanese were advancing, and MacArthur was becoming very nervous and very disturbed about this. And MacArthur concluded that the Australians didn't know what they were doing. He blamed the Australians. He thought the Australians had a better manpower advantage than they actually did. And he disparaged the fighting abilities of Australian soldiers and Australian commanders as well. I'll remind everyone, these were already battle-experienced soldiers, but this was MacArthur's attitude. So he wanted to send in American troops, and he sent in the 32nd Division. So the first elements come in September. What MacArthur basically wanted to do was try to get elements of the 32nd Division over the mountains to outflank the Japanese and cut off the Japanese on the Kokoda Track.
Easier said than done.
Yes, because MacArthur was just as ignorant of the interior of New Guinea as anybody else was. And again, I'll stress, this is a place with no railroads, no highways. Its transportation is mostly by water or basically footpaths or tracks through the jungle. The Owen Stanley Range, these mountains are as high as the Rocky Mountains. This was an exceptionally difficult environment to operate in. So 2 of the 3 regiments of the 32nd Division went to Papua. The 127th Infantry, they flew into Port Moresby. And this is the first time in U.S. military history that soldiers were flown into a combat zone. So there's a first for the Red Arrow. A 2nd regiment, the 126th, this was mostly made up of Michigan soldiers. It took the boat. It took longer. 1 regiment, the 127th, remained behind. And so the question is how to get some of these Red Arrow soldiers over the mountains. Now, there was another pathway called the Kappa Kappa Track. And MacArthur had intelligence that they sent an expedition over the mountain range, and the officer reported back that it was passable. Fact of the matter is it wasn't. And the Australians said, this is probably not a good idea. And so they sent a battalion of the 126th over the Kappa Kappa Track, and it emerged from the mountains exhausted, malaria-ridden, and not in much of a condition to fight. And it became pretty clear that going over the mountains was not going to work. Here again, airplanes came to the rescue. American and Australian engineers had managed to construct airfields on the North Shore. So the remaining troops actually flew over while the Australians are pushing the Japanese back over the Kokoda Track. So here by late October, November, American and Australian forces are beginning to approach the Japanese at Buna. And here again, I'll stress just how alien this environment was, particularly for American soldiers. Wisconsin and Michigan are known for forests and hunting and these sorts of things, but few had ever seen anything quite like this. So the logistics of moving things around were very difficult, especially without much cooperation from the Navy. So how do you get supplies to those soldiers? Well, there was a fleet of small ships that were basically cobbled together. And they transported goods. You can see in the background of this photograph here what one of these small ships looked like. They were literally pleasure boats,
Yeah.
some captured Japanese vessels. I mean, whatever they could cobble together. And they can't carry very much. And they certainly can't carry things like tanks, big artillery pieces, right? So what they can actually transport is very limited. So any attack at this point is going to be on a logistical shoestring. So this is another nightmare facing the division. I think we need to acknowledge the role of Papua New Guineans in this battle as well. There were a few who were organized into infantry, the Papua Infantry Battalion, but most the Australians organized most as laborers. So building the roads, building the ports. Here you see Papua New Guineans evacuating soldiers. By most accounts, labor and discipline in these units was very, very harsh. But they were critical to the Allied effort as well. So if we go back to the maps here, the one on your left, this sort of shows the situation as Allied forces begin to approach now by November of 1942. The Japanese are in three pockets along the north coast of Papua. On the far west was Gona. In the center was Sanananda and Sanananda Point. This was where most Japanese troops were and where the Japanese had their headquarters. The Australians would deal with those two pockets with a little bit of help from American troops. This is mostly Australian. Where most of the 32nd Division fight would be at Buna. So the map on the right shows you the Buna Battlefield, and I think it's probably more visible here. So let's just go this. Yeah. Let's go to this slide here. So there was a sort of an elongated pocket along the coast. On the far east was a coconut plantation. And there were some airfields here as well. This was an area that was designated the Warren Front. And then on the far left, you had a place called Buna Village. And not too far from that was the Buna Government Station, which Americans erroneously but continuously referred to as Buna Mission. So these are going to be the two, and the battlefront on the eastern part is going to be known as the Urbana Front. So there's this elongated battlefield, and in between is a lot of swampland that was largely impassable, basically a big moat for the Japanese. And there were very few avenues on which the Red Arrow Division could approach the plantation or the Buna Village or Buna Mission. And those approaches were studded. Here we go. They were studded with many bunkers that were well fortified, that were camouflaged. You can see here an example of one. If you look at this carefully, you can make out a GI in there, but you do have to look carefully. And there were hundreds of these bunkers all over the place, and they were very strategically located at the only real avenues that the Americans could use to get at their goals. So the Japanese had prepared the battlefield very, very well. Here again, intelligence estimates were way off. The Allies believe that there were probably only about 2,000 Japanese left at Buna, and they believe that they were malaria-ridden and running out of ammunition. It was Harding who said that Buna would be quote unquote easy pickings. In fact, there were far more Japanese at Buna, had recently been reinforced, had enough ammunition and weapons. Again, Red Arrow went in there not really understanding what they were in for. So MacArthur orders the Allies forward, including the Red Arrow Division at Buna. On November 19th, the first attack comes on the Warren Front across the plantation called the Duropa Plantation. This was the so-called baptism of fire. And these soldiers who had not been prepared for jungle warfare and not really trained very well in camouflage and all these sorts of things, and not expecting to get much resistance. I think they had 1 day's rations when they went there. They didn't expect to be in combat very long. They found themselves pinned down and basically mowed down. And they had light weapons, machine guns, and mortars. There's very little artillery. Air support was totally inadequate, not very accurate. Bombs were dropped at sea or on Allied forces. I mean, it was a real mess. Certainly no armor or anything like this, given the supply line. That wasn't going to be possible yet. And the division doesn't get very far. And then it's much the same on the Urbana front, where the attack begins on November 21st. Very little progress being made. So Red Arrow soldiers were quite shocked, dumbfounded, I think one might say. And given the weapons that they had, not to mention their level of experience, they don't get very far. And there's a lot of consternation at MacArthur's headquarters. Remember, he had already disparaged Australian fighting capabilities. And, you know, the Americans are bragging, we're going to go in there and kick butt and take over. And that's not happening. And MacArthur, I think it's fair to say, was personally embarrassed. You know, Blamey said, you know, we want Australian troops there because we know they're going to fight. So MacArthur was quite angry. He was angry at Harding. He was angry at the 32nd Division, as I noted before. Sometimes MacArthur's headquarters pointed to individual National Guard officers as being part of the problem. He wanted Harding out of there. So he sent Eichelberger up to Buna to take command. He was the Corps commander. And as MacArthur famously told him, quote, take Buna or don't come back alive. Now, whether that's meant to be inspiring or just callous, I guess I'll leave that to the individual. But it certainly sounds ominous. And Eichelberger went there, and at first it didn't have much more success. Again, experience, lack of weapons, they're just not going to get too far. But by December, that starts to change now. The division does begin to gain experience. After fighting for several weeks and not getting anywhere, they start to learn the hard way about concealment, how to take down a bunker. And I might also add that there were very few people in the division who actually had some combat experience. And that really seemed to make a difference. One of the most interesting people in the division was Sergeant Herman Bacher, who was born in Germany, and he was a communist. He had immigrated first to Australia, then the United States. He fought in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, so he had battlefield experience. He came back to the United States, joined the U.S. Army, and he was there at Buna. And on December the 5th, he led an attack between Buna Village and Buna Mission, reached the seacoast, managed to hold on to that position. This becomes known as Botcher's Corner, and he basically separated one important Japanese position from another. And as I noted before, other Red Arrow soldiers begin to get that experience. And other things are beginning to start to turn in favor of the Allies in the Red Arrow Division. Reinforcements begin to show up. The 3rd Regiment of the division, the 127th, shows up in December. Australian infantry begins to come as well, bringing their not only numbers but experience as well. While at the same time, the Japanese are finding it harder and harder to get reinforcements. The logistical situation is improving. The engineers are building ports, airfields. There were 2 airfield complexes, one the Australians used, one the Americans used, to bring in supplies, soldiers, bring out the wounded, building roads to connect various positions. So it's now possible to bring more stuff and bigger stuff to the battlefront, including, and here's the really critical thing, I think, at Buna, Australian tanks.
Yeah.
They attacked on the Warren Front December 18th, and now sliced through these Japanese positions that had stymied the division for a month. Really. So here you can see these maps. Now the front finally starts to move. The battle's turning decisively in favor of the Allies. In this case here, the Americans, with some Australian troops there as well. And again, the tanks, absolutely critical. And Buna Mission, the last Japanese position, finally fell on January the 2nd of 1943. It was at this point that MacArthur declared victory, but there was still one last position that had to be taken, and it was the largest of the Japanese pockets, and that was Sanandana. The Australians had already taken care of Gona, but Sanandana still had to be taken. Good night. So this last offensive, this final offensive, was largely Australian. There were some Red Arrow soldiers that came along the coast from the east. But by January 22nd, the battle at Buna was declared over. And it happened several weeks before the battle at Guadalcanal was officially declared over. So the Red Arrow claimed the title of being the first U.S. Army division to defeat. And again, this battle occurs concurrently with the battle at Guadalcanal. And the Battle of Guadalcanal, of course, is famous. Everyone's heard of it. Every textbook points to it as a turning point in the Pacific War. And yet the contribution of the Red Arrow at this concurrent battle really never captured the public imagination to the American public. Australia, of course, it's going to be different, but in the American mind, they never really captured the public imagination. And I'm not sure it was just the Marine publicity machine here either. Guadalcanal was bigger. Perhaps it's because this victory at Buna was a joint American-Australian endeavor. Maybe that's one reason it didn't capture.
Dilutes the interest a bit, yeah.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, it's hard to gauge these sorts of things. But the Red Arrow Division, even though it had won this victory with the Australians, its reputation in MacArthur's headquarters, in fact, wasn't very good. And there was a perception that the Red Arrow Division had somehow failed. And MacArthur seemed to carry a grudge against the division. Now, here's what Eichelberger wrote in his memoir. I'll paraphrase it here. A great deal is written about how the 32nd Division failed, but he notes that the 32nd Division was also the division that won there, and nobody else did that. So not everybody at MacArthur's headquarters agreed with that, but there was this lingering prejudice, animosity in MacArthur's headquarters towards the 32nd Division. Now, for the soldiers themselves, of course, they were glad it was over, obviously, and they were proud of what they had done. Here's what one soldier named James Myers wrote in his memoir, quote, "We fought the Japanese, we fought the jungle, the rain and mud, the insects, swamps, and diseases, and we won." And just one little aside here about Myers. He came from a musical family in Philadelphia. And in the 1950s, under the pseudonym of Jimmy DeKnight, he co-wrote a song called "Rock Around the Clock."
Oh, well, there you go.
Would,
wow.
Of course, help to unleash a major popular culture musical genre, right? So, and in fact, there were a number of some people in the division who, after the war, went on to some very significant accomplishments. But I thought I'd throw that in there.
Brilliant
Sort of
stuff. And and before we move on, I think
yeah, sure.
we've talked about a lot on the channel. If we can see the development, particularly of how to do amphibious landings across the island hopping campaign, for me, New Guinea is where the Americans and Australians kind of learn how to do ground fighting in the Pacific. I mean, they learn elsewhere. Guadalcanal, there are huge lessons learned. But to me, the learning curve on New Guinea, and we've had Phil Bradley on talking about the Australians, as you mentioned, the development of bulldozers going in and building airstrips and taking supplies by aircraft and moving artillery around. There's some real innovations in New Guinea that end up being influential elsewhere, and yet it does seem to be overlooked. I say, as you said, the Australians don't overlook it, but as we always say, the Japanese see it as one battle. It isn't New Guinea and Guadalcanal. It's just one big Solomon Islands campaign. It's
exactly.
Americans and Australians who separate it. But we don't talk enough about New Guinea, and it's at our own. We're losing out by not seeing the developments there. And yes, there is some friction between Australians and Americans, and there's friction within the command structure, but you can definitely see this real improvement of how to do things.
Yes, I'll say two things. First of all, while there was tension between Australians and Americans at the higher levels, when I read the Red Arrow, the memoirs and interviews with 32nd Division soldiers, I offhand cannot recall one disparaging criticism any one of them ever made towards the Australians. They were grateful for their experience, for fighting alongside with them. I'm not an expert on the Australian Army. I don't know what the typical digger thought at this time, but I can tell you the Red Arrow soldiers were, they thought very highly of the Australian soldier. And yes, New Guinea, there was the cartwheel campaign I'll get to in a second. There's a little bit of that the Red Arrow Division participated in. And that's where, the Marines had been working on their amphibious doctrine. But here's where the real practice the experience begins to come in. Yeah, and as 32nd Division soldiers sometimes said, we wrote the book on jungle warfare. I suppose in a larger sense, this is where the book for the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, is being written on amphibious operations as well. It's experience that was gained the hard way, and Buna showed how important those amphibious operations really would be in a campaign like this. MacArthur famously said, "No more Bunas." Right? You don't see too many other battles, no significant ones, where they come over land like this. So there were some very hard lessons learned here. Yes, absolutely.
Brilliant.
All right. So after Buna, the division was basically off for just about a year for rest and reorganization. It went to Australia, then later moved up to New Guinea again in late 1943. It got a new commander, General William H. Gill, who had a reputation for being a stern disciplinarian. And, one wonders, I don't have any evidence of this, but one wonders if MacArthur selected a tough, stern disciplinarian for the 32nd Division because of his perceived inadequacies that the division supposedly had, or whether there's some spite involved in this in some way or another. There's no way to prove that, but it might seem that way. I can tell you he certainly was not popular among most of the soldiers. There most certainly was intensified training, again, now informed by many of the lessons learned in the Buna campaign and other campaigns in the Pacific as well. Replacements begin to come in. So, there had long been this sort of changeover from the old National Guard contingent to a more nationalized force. This began even before they left the United States, but certainly after Buna. The casualty rate at Buna for the 32nd Division, if you include disease, was a little bit under 90%. So many recovered and went back to duty, but many others left. So they brought in thousands of replacements. And for an infantry division of about 15,000, I mean, that's a significant turnover of personnel. And these replacements now come in from across the nation. They're no longer just from the upper Midwestern United States. It's a truly national force, and they've been trained in the training camps back in the United States. So this leads to a very significant changeover of personnel, attitude, I suppose you might say, among the 32nd Division. And many of the old contingent by early 1944 are being rotated back to the United States. So you can still find a few cases of the old National Guard soldiers from Louisiana still being on duty when you get to the Philippines in 1945, but almost all of them were gone by the time the battles were over. So there's a major turnover of personnel going on here as well. The next battle, the next battles that the division participated in were minor. Sidor, this was the tail end of Cartwheel. The division came into a place called Sidor on the north coast of New Guinea, this time amphibiously. Yeah. Took an airfield, built a PT boat base, which seems to be what the Americans were mostly after. The Australians were, I think the word I use in the book is apoplectic, that the Red Arrow was not able to stop Japanese forces from retreating against their advance. They went through the mountains and around Sidor, and the Red Arrow sent patrols out into the mountains and jungles, but still thousands and thousands of Japanese soldiers managed to bypass the position. American commanders commented frequently that this wasn't a very significant operation. So I think the Australians and Americans once again viewed this rather differently. By April 1944, Red Arrow soldiers now stage an amphibious landing at a place called Aitape. Here again, to take an airfield. Those airfields were so very important in this leapfrogging campaign across the Pacific. So they held this position. They held off a pretty strong Japanese counterattack in July of 1944, and they managed to successfully hold this position. But the next major battle that the Red Arrow Division participated in was in the Philippines on Leyte Island. MacArthur finally returns to the Philippines as promised in October of 1944. The Red Arrow Division goes to Leyte in November of 1944, and they're put in a mountain area along the north coast of the island that gained the nickname Breakneck Ridge. Another American division, the 24th, had been trying to punch through it for a while and had become exhausted. The 32nd Division was then sent in. And basically for the next 6 weeks, it was a hard slogging campaign along Highway 2, trying to punch a hole through the Japanese lines into the Ormoc Valley. Just to the south of Breakneck Ridge was the city of Ormoc and the Ormoc Valley. And here again, the Red Arrow Division was going more slowly than General MacArthur would have liked. As Eichelberger recorded in his diary, a quote from MacArthur, quote, "Big Chief said 32nd had never been any good." So that grudge still that resurfaced at Leyte. I think that's unfair. In fact, it was the 32nd Division that had punched that hole through the mountains, had basically opened the door for the advance on Ormoc. So it's not necessarily just how much territory you take, but what territory you take. And this was very important territory. And I'll note, as I'm sure many are already aware, that the Japanese were very well dug in and really excellent at defensive warfare. So it was not easy, but the division punched through. Then after just a few weeks at the end of that conclusion, the Red Arrow Division was sent to Luzon. American forces invaded the Philippines at Lingayen Gulf in January. The 32nd Division was sent again a little bit after the main invasion. Now there, of course, is the famous dash to Manila, where MacArthur does show his face at the front. But there was also a movement to the northern part of Luzon Island, to the Cagayan River Valley, where General Yamashita, the Japanese commander of the Philippines, was located. And so there were several divisions that tried to push through those mountains. The Red Arrow Division was one of them. It drew the task of taking another mountain pathway called the Villa Verde Trail. This was pioneered by a Spanish priest in the 1800s to bring Christianity to the mountains. In some places, this was little more than a footpath. And once again, as you might imagine, the Japanese studded this area with caves and bunkers, particularly at the mountain pass separating the two valleys. And once again, it was months of fighting. A desperate, bloody fight for every hill, for every cave. As I'm sure many are aware by now, the Japanese had begun this war of attrition, trying to wear down Allied forces to dissuade them from an invasion of Japan. So the point was to inflict heavy casualties. I'll also note that this is going on at the exact same time as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, far more famous battles, as we talked about at the beginning today. The Philippines, I think, is oftentimes neglected in the way we think about World War II in the Pacific. So more hard fighting. And I'd like to also give a shout out to the engineers who took this footpath and turned it into a highway that was capable of carrying tanks, armored vehicles, trucks, Jeeps, all kinds of other conveyances that will be very important in bringing stuff to the front and bringing wounded soldiers out. So again, those, and I was going to say those, sometimes these engineers were actually in the middle of the fight. The bulldozers sometimes were used to bulldoze over Japanese positions. So these non-infantry soldiers are oftentimes really important in the fighting as well. And
just a quick question for you, Mark. Just
yes.
When you're talking about MacArthur and the reputation the 32nd have got, and is it fair to say that MacArthur doesn't necessarily understand the attritional aspect of war? When we talked early on the channel this year about for example, the post-Normandy campaign, the Allies had to decide between, are they trying to liberate peoples, are they trying to gain territory, or are they trying to make sure they destroy the German army ahead of them? So what the 32nd are doing now is they're making, although it's slow progress, they are destroying the Japanese ahead of them. The Japanese are doing their best to slow them down, but as they move on, they're eliminating them. Whereas, do you think MacArthur's a little bit focused on speed and distance and covering it, and not really grasping the fact that it's all very well moving, but you've got to move on having destroyed the enemy?
I don't consider myself to be an expert on MacArthur. So I'd be a little hesitant to say too much. What I would say is that my view is that MacArthur was obsessed with getting back to the Philippines and taking Manila. And then once Manila was taken and, utterly destroyed, he wanted to liberate the entire archipelago. There were those who thought, okay, we've got Manila, we've got the Luzon Central Plain. This is a good enough base from which to invade Japan. We don't really need to go into the mountains of northern Luzon. We had enough. But MacArthur wanted to take everything. So what MacArthur's thoughts were on attriting Yamashita, or was he just obsessed with taking all of the Philippines to live out his fantasy of being the Philippine savior? I would defer to a MacArthur expert on that. I
mean, we all think we have an opinions on MacArthur, but it's just about those interesting investigations in a sense to the what is someone's primary goal. Because defeating enemy is a bit too simplistic. It's what are you, how to defeat them, and his personal connection with and affection for the Philippines clouds everything he does. And I don't necessarily mean that only in a negative way, in a positive way. It's borderline obsessional, but that can be a good thing as well as a bad thing, depending on your point of view. But anyways, it's a fantastic presentation, by the way. So I'm gonna hand it back to you to carry on through, because it really is tremendous.
All right, thank you. I'll also say that I think by this time MacArthur's beginning to focus on Japan too. So I would tend towards the what was that phrase you used? His obsession with trying to take the Philippines and starting to focus on Japan. So many have argued that these campaigns really weren't necessary.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so he's almost done here. There are some last campaigns during mid-1945 in northern Luzon, basically trying to reduce the holdings that Yamashita still clinged to. At the time of VJ Day in August of 1945, Yamashita holds just a very small, if you can see in this map here, a little bean-shaped region. And even after the Japanese announced their intention to surrender, fighting still occurred in the northern Philippines. Some Japanese soldiers wouldn't give up, and some Japanese soldiers didn't hear that didn't hear or couldn't believe that Japan surrendered. Yamashita negotiates his surrender, and he finally does turn himself into the 32nd Division on September 2nd of 1945, on the very same day that the instruments of surrender were signed in Tokyo Bay. And that finally brought an end to the 654 days of combat that the Red Arrow experienced. And what did the Japanese think of the Red Arrow Division? We know what MacArthur thought about the Red Arrow Division. Well, General Walter Kruger wrote in his memoirs the following quote here. General Yamashita indicated that he considered the 32nd Division the best troops encountered both on Leyte and Luzon. So while MacArthur may still have had an issue with the 32nd Division, the Japanese seem to afford it a certain amount of respect. And again, as we saw, the division was utterly transformed over the course of the war from part-time soldiers, small town factory workers and farmers, to a battle-hardened, battle-experienced division that took part in battles at some very critical parts of the war against a very tough opponent. There was then the occupation of Japan. After all of that, they arrived in October. The division was finally demobilized in February of 1946, and the Red Arrow's World War II was finally over. Just some numbers here. Killed in action, 1,600. That was the highest for any U.S. Army division in the Pacific during the Second World War. Battle-related deaths would, of course, be people who died of wounds and disease and those sorts of things, just a smidge over 2,000, 5,600 wounded, and as we've already established, 654 days in combat. So it was quite a ride. Again, not participating in any of the signature battles of the Second World War, but there for the really hard slog, and took part in some of the most important turning points of the Second World War. And I think for those reasons, the 32nd Division should be a bigger part of our discussions about the war in the Pacific. And with that, Paul, I thank you, and anyone still watching, I thank you as well.
Well, brilliant. And there, of course, is Mark's website there. And a couple of questions for you, and I'll get
Sure.
that. But Terry Down in the audience says he's read James Campbell's book, The Ghost Mountain Boys, absolutely harrowing account of the 32nd in the campaign. So that's one of the other books that does cover the division. But I was referring to what you said earlier about not having books written about them. But it's that weird thing that the units end up being written about a lot, then by definition get written about even more, because there are then secondary sources that the next author can draw on to write their book. So it ends up becoming kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that,
Sure.
if you want to write a book about the 82nd Airborne, there are forget about even going to archives. You can just go straight to Amazon and have 20 books come back into your, the next day into your mailbox, and you can start with the secondary sources. Whereas if a unit hasn't had that divisional kind of study, then you have to go straight back to the archives, which some people just don't want to do. They don't want to do that hard work.
Or they can't. It takes money to go sit in the National Archives for a long time. So yeah, it does sort of feed upon itself, and some units get more famous and more famous. Perhaps also, when I wrote this, I read the U.S. Army's Green Book series for many of those. It's sometimes my starting point, just to get that sort of overall narrative. And perhaps those official Army books, maybe they still have that regular Army, what's the word I'm looking for? Prejudice against.
Well, and they're all as good as they are, and no historian of note has dismissed the Green Books for the American point. They're essential kind of starting points, but they can be very dry, because where an author might say something like the brilliant performance of, or the incredible bravery of, they're very formulaic as they move through there. This was achieved, and it doesn't necessarily kind of get your juices flowing reading them, because they're plodding is maybe a bit offensive, but you know what I mean. They don't lend themselves to creating a sense of excitement about these units.
No, they don't. I think maybe the hardest part of the book to write was the section about the Villa Verde Trail, because if you read the Green Book version of this, it's Hill 422, and this happened on this date, and Company B went here, and to try to pull out a narrative that would be interesting to the civilian reader, that was a challenge. That was a challenge. And reading those, I did sometimes think that maybe the National Guard divisions were slighted. The book on Leyte in particular, I thought could have had more about the 32nd Division, but didn't. So that might be a factor there as well.
Then we've got a few questions that we'll plow through. So Sir Capo is saying, would you expand on how the culture of the division changed with the replacements? Because that's something we've had Steve Clay on a few times talking about the 1st Division in ETO and how brilliant they were at bringing in the newbies. And he says that the awful kind of movie cliches of the veteran soldiers not wanting to befriend the new guys couldn't be further from the truth from the 1st Division. So
Yeah.
You're talking about a unit that had its roots in these locations, National Guard, sort of strong identity, but of course it evolves. People are rotated out. Commanders. Was there how? Well, I'll give the question. How did the culture change?
Well, again, when you think about how long the division was on active, there were many different culture changes. I think
Yeah,
that's
of
what I would
course.
say. Again, that very when the division mobilized in 1940. Again, you've got the farmers and the factory workers and the gas station attendant, and these are all very close-knit people, oftentimes related to each other, know each other from the same hometowns, had gone to the same drills and summer camps for years and years and years. And were very resentful in Louisiana about the U.S. Army coming in and purging officers. And then before the division, just before it went to Australia, it was still like 3,000 soldiers short. And so they just threw a bunch of guys from training camps in California into the division. That's how Herman Bottcher got into the 32nd Division. He lived in San Francisco. He was thrown in there. My observation is also what you noted was that this idea that people hated the replacements and stuff. That's you can find examples of that, obviously, but I also read many soldiers say we welcomed the replacements, even if in sort of with dark humor saying we wanted fresh blood.
Yeah.
They welcomed replacements, and many people who came into the division, they noted how well they were treated, how the older soldiers were willing to show them the ropes and give them advice. Now, this can be a very tough environment. It's that sort of manosphere, I guess, as we might say today. And sometimes it can be some tough love. And I'm sure there were fights and all those sorts of things. But they all had an interest in cooperating with each other and working with each other.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's in everybody's interest for the team to carry on functioning properly. Otherwise, people die, So the idea that you kind of treat new recruits as outcasts and not, but it doesn't promote the unity you're trying to keep together to make sure you win battles. So well, thanks for explaining that. So Terry asked about, we're going back to New Guinea there. Does Mark have anything to say about the Battle of Junimore in the 30 seconds part therein?
Yeah, I didn't use the term Junimore, but yeah, this was at Itape.
Right.
In mid-1944. The Red Arrow had taken the airfield, but they put a covering force, I forget, about 15, 20 miles to the east along the Junimore River. And that was to sort of try to stop any Japanese attack on the airstrip that might develop. And the Japanese did attack. It was July of 1944. So that is the Junimore River. That's what the person's referring to. Yeah.
Scott Grimwood is reminding us that there's a great museum in Madison, Wisconsin, and I've got a great friend living in Madison, Wisconsin. I'll have to tell her about it. I'm sure she knows about it. Jim Walsh, just a humor, sort of a light question to finish the presentation off. You talked about the co-writer Rock Around the Clock. Any more members became sort of famous post-war? Did they produce any movie stars or sportsmen or politicians?
Yeah, well, two things. I want to go back to the other comment before.
Yep.
But even go back further. I enjoyed the James Campbell book too, I have to say.
Right, okay, yeah.
I used it. Second of all, as for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, I used to work there. I started there as a work-study student in college. I had been discharged from the Air Force a few years before. I absolutely wanted nothing to do with the military. I told myself I would never have anything to do with the military ever again. But they had a work-study job there, and I took it. And I went from that to being on the staff. I served as the archivist and historian there. I ran the oral history program there, so I was there for many years. Some of the exhibits I worked on are still there today. And that's really where I not only learned about U.S. military history and World War II in particular, but it's really where my interest in the World War II GI came, because it was the 1990s. And these men, and often women, were still very much around. They volunteered at the museum. They stopped in and they made comments on the exhibits. And I interviewed many for the oral history program. And so that's really where my interest in the soldier and the 32nd Division, that's where I really began to think about the 32nd Division more seriously. So the Wisconsin Veterans Museum played a big part in my career. And so I wanted to get that shout out there.
Yeah, well, and you have successfully done so. So thank you.
And as for other famous people in the 32nd Division, I'll note a few. There was a soldier named Raymond Dassman from California, who would go on to be a leader in the environmental movement. He had published several books about environmentalism. There was a writer for the New Yorker who was drafted and eventually ended up in the 32nd Division, named E.J. Kahn. And he, General Harding was commander at the time. And as I noted, Harding liked literature. And so he made sure that this already notable writer from the New Yorker ended up on his staff. He was his clerk. And so he published several articles about the 32nd Division. He published a book called GI Jungle about the 32nd Division's role in at Buna. You know, Kahn left when Harding left in 1942, but his writings are very important to understand that early part of the division. So he went on to become continued to be a notable writer. There was a religiously minded young man from a wealthy family in Baltimore named John Rawls. He wanted to be an Episcopal minister. He served in the 128th Infantry Division, became very disillusioned with religion as a result of his, what he witnessed in the war. After the war, on the GI Bill, he studied philosophy and he became a leading figure in philosophy in the 20th century. He had what was called the theory of justice, which was very influential in political circles in the 1960s. So if you take a philosophy class, you're very likely to come across John Rawls.
Wow.
So these are some people who were, Kahn wasn't quite an ordinary person when he joined the division, but the others were just kids, basically, who after the war went on to some notable careers in various ways, from music to academia.
Brilliant. And 11 Medal of Honors, as I understand. Which is
11 Medals of Honor,
which is pretty extraordinary. We talk about the 3rd Division fighting through Italy and south of France, with a lot, but yeah, I mean, if that, not the medals necessarily define the efficiency and reputation of a division, they're more about individuals, but it's still a good indicator that they know what they're doing. And you have given us a fantastic presentation about what shouldn't be an unsung contributor to the victory in the Pacific War, but is a bit. But thanks to this presentation, thanks to your book, a little bit more publicity for the guys on the ground. So we fantastic job there. So folks, again, thank you for your questions and your comments. The link to Mark's book is in the description below. You can find it from your local bookstore. Visit his website. Consider becoming a patron to the channel or a YouTube channel member. But next week, we have 9 shows coming your way next week. So I'm going to have a weekend off, and I will see you all next week. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your week. Cheers, everybody. Bye. Thank you, Mark.